So remember when I said the comment section was going to be destroyed? One of the notes we have here under Boros is that it's not the worst anymore. I disagree. I still believe it's the worst color combination.
Even worse than like Azorius?
Yes.
And welcome everybody to another episode of the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host, Callahan. We have a great show lined up for you all today. Before we get into it, just want to thank you all for joining us this week. If you like this episode or any of our other episodes, please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below. If you want access to our Discord server as well as some extra content, make sure to head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/themindsculptors or check out the link in the description. If you want to pick up any of the cards we're talking about today, you can head on over to our TCG Player affiliate link that's also in the description below as well. Today, we're going to be talking about the enemy color pairings, and joining me for this discussion is, again, our good friend Cobblepott. Cobble, how you doing today?
Doing well. Good to be here.
Good. And also joining us again is Spleenface. Spleen, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. I do think it's important to point out that this is twice now that you refer to Cobblepott as your good friend and Spleenface, but you know what? We'll live.
Oh, man. So last week we talked about the allied color pairings. We had a lot of discussion around that stuff. This week we're back to talk about the enemy color pairings, and looking at it right away. We were talking about this a little bit before we started off. Is Cobble, we were talking about Orzhov, right? And how it's like comical how you would think that adding black to this to white would make it like stand out really big, right? But you know, there's some issues with Orzhov. So when we're looking at Orzhov, what's really going on with this color pairing?
So the thing with Orzhov is similar to the thing that is going on with Azorius, where you've got instead of blue plus white, you got black plus white. And you think that maybe, you know, you've got blue or black. Those are both of the best colors in Magic. You know, maybe black would help to, boost up their ability to make a showing in the field. But again, it's got a similar issue with the tension between wanting to go fast and wanting to go slow, because white is good at going slow and black is good at going fast. And because of the lack of blue in this case and the lack of stack interaction, I mean, it can protect itself with silence kind of abilities, but it can't disrupt other people especially not Thassa's Oracle Consult. So it's one of those things where it really, if it wants to be able to win, it's not going to be able to race the fastest decks. So instead, it needs to bear down and do the thing that it's good at, which is stacks generally, because the white side of it has, you know, the Rule of Laws and the Rest in Pieces and Drannith Magistrates and the Mind Sensors and the Op Agents. And another thing that complicates it is that Orzhov as a pair in, WotC's view is that it's like the life drain pair where, you've got all of the Blood Artist effects and things that are just incremental. Whenever you gain a life, everybody else loses a life. And that's kind of the personality that Orzhov has. And that might be reasonable in 20 life contexts, but in a 40 life context, it often is not great. And this is compounded by the fact that a lot of the times we want to put together a combo. There's not really 2-card combos in Orzhov that are concise that win the game. Normally it's a 3-card combo where you got to have like a Blood Artist and Leonin Relic Warder and Animate Dead, or Micaeus and Ballista and a sack outlet. There's just a lot more setup for actually winning the game. And that compounds kind of the other issues that the color combination has. And it's not like there's, it's really bad at really anything else. I mean, it's got the black tutors. It's got really good removal. It's got excellent rituals. It's got Yogg-Will and all the reanimation stuff. It's got all the best card advantage with Naws and Necro and Tymna and Esper Sentinel. I mean, it also folds pretty hard to Grave Hate. So it's just in this very conflicted tension, and it's unfortunate. And I mean, this is evidenced by the way that we see it in the metagame. And before we started recording, we kind of said, okay, name an Orzhov deck that's on the database without looking it up. And Spleen, of course, knew it because he's one of the reviewers, but
cheater.
as an exercise to the viewers at home, can you name the Orzhov deck that's in the database? Chances are probably no, because there's not a lot of great options.
And so your options are so for the people who have paused, gone and looked and got their answers.
Welcome back.
Welcome back. Thank you for joining us. Your options are Teysa Scion or what is the name of it?
Scion.
There it is. And then Tymna Tevesh. And Morgan, when we look at these, we aren't given really awesome options, right? Because Tymna really wants to have creatures that attack with it, and Tymna Tevesh is not doing that very well, I feel like. I mean, what's really your perspective?
Well, so I mean, you could partner Tymna with anything, but I think it's pretty. I don't think many people would dispute that of all the Orzhov legendaries, Tymna's the best, and I don't think it's particularly close. And Tymna has part.
Agreed.
So if you're gonna build a Tymna deck, why are you limiting yourself to 2 colors, right? What's the point of that? Unless you really think that Tevesh is just the best, enabler for your strategy, which seems kind of unlikely for most strategies. It's just so
especially
obvious,
in Orzhov.
You want a Planeswalker partner to go with Tymna? Well, why not Jeska? You want some big beefy, stacks parity breaker. Why not Kodama or even Kamal if you're one of those people. So we don't talk about those people. So you're kind of at the point where your next best option. I mean, maybe I'm not even convinced that Teysa Orzhov Scion is the next best Orzhov commander, but just all of them are very, they don't seem particularly rewarding. Some people have memed with Karlov of the Toast Council. You just play a Soul Sister or something, and then you play your commander on turn 2, and then hopefully he's a 10/10 on turn 3. And that's funny, and every once in a while it works. But then, you come up against a deck that just chumps forever, or they just kill it a couple times, you can't recast it, or someone just plays Oracle Consult or whatever. And I think, going back to what we were talking about with, white is a very slow color in almost every context. Almost all of its tools have to do with not losing the game. Be that static effects, some of its removal, those sorts of things. Obviously silences are used to protect your wins, same with Ranger Captain, but they are also, Ranger Captain in particular is a very rattlesnakey effect where if you don't have a combo that works through it, you can't even try and win while it's on the field. And black is kind of a speed enabling color. And there's just not sort of the glue that holds those two together that you see when you get to any of the white, black, X3 color combinations. Like with green, you're going to lean into the stacks. I know there's the bad farm decks, but you lean into the stacks, you then get the dork mana, you get the creature tutors for more consistent access to the hate bears you need. In red, you sort of double up on the speed, so you lean into Turbonaz generally. Blue just lets you have interaction, and so you can play like a number of different strategies. You can play sort of a more hate berry one or a Turbonaz one, but the blue interaction helps you sort of bridge white's disruptive effects plus blue's interaction. Makes up for the fact that you don't have something to double up on black speed, plus you get Oracle Consult. And so when you have, like, you know, if we look at the good white cards, we're talking about stuff like Rule of Law or, you know, various hate bears. And then if we look at black cards, we're like, Ad Nauseam, Necropotence, Dark Ritual. Like, fun thing about all those cards, not actually great under a Rule of Law.
Right.
So there's sort of a lot of tension between what those decks are generally trying to do, and it's very difficult to thread that line without the tools that at least one more color gives you. Like, I guess you could play either the Staxy deck, but you just really wish you had green, you know, to sort of smooth out the win conditions a little bit and let you break parity. You can lean into Null Rod and Collector Roof, or you wish you had red to go fast with your Turbonaz deck. As I said, like, the strong tools in each of the colors do not play nicely at all, and you're kind of lacking in the commander department. Other than Timna, who is so free to just play more colors with that, like, why bother?
Right. When you look at this, I'm going to posit this question to both of you. When you look at these, sort of at we've talked about Selesnya so far, we've talked about Azorius so far, we've talked about Orzhov so far, and we kind of look at these three. Does Orzhov feel like it's the worst of those three that we've talked about so far, or do you feel like which one do you feel would be the worst one of those?
Selesnya, Orzhov, and
Azorius. Because I think they all end up having very similar issues, right?
Selesnya, not so much, but Azorius and Orzhov are very similar in the style, the tension that exists between the two colors and what they want to do.
I guess I don't know that I think there's that much internal tension in Azorius. I think I would say that I have like two methods of evaluation, and one of them sort of holistic and one of them is a little bit more empirical. And I think holistically, Azorius is not the worst of those three color combinations, but empirically it will be. And the reason I think that is because things that can go fast will get rewarded for that ability more than, like, so if you think about a 2-player game of Magic and your deck has some performance spectrum, right? You could have a deck that always performs at the exact same level, or you could have a deck that sort of spikes and craters and spikes and craters. And in a 1-versus-1 context, almost any strategy will have a similar win rate against a wide mix-up of strategies, right? If you have you perform at exactly the same level, somebody has, assuming every deck has the same average. Obviously, there's matchup dependencies and whatever, but if you just perform perfectly average, and you come up against some deck that like craters and then spikes and craters, you'll win the games they crater, you'll lose the games they spike. you could do some like weird, you have like, you perform it 60% of the time and then you crater and then you and then that might beat a 50% deck, but against, some other pattern, they all kind of average out. But that's not true in a 4-player free-for-all, because your deck needs to perform better than the best of the 3 decks you're playing against, which means you tend to get rewarded for decks that have incredible power spikes. Like a deck that 1 in 10 games presents a protected turn 2 win. Just like wins that game some ridiculous portion of the time, right? And so that's 10% of your win rate done and dusted. And then some other deck that, is always presenting interaction on turn 3 and, develops a card advantage engine by turn 4 and all of that, like, 1 game, you lose turn 2 and you're like, well, shoot. And then the next game, someone has their like crazy, they just like stacks you out or whatever, and you lose. And so decks that can spike their power and win super fast, like an Orzhov deck, like, oh, look, I just opened, my hand was like, land, Dark Ritual, Necro, and then I drew 30 cards and did something stupid on turn 2.
Meat Hook Massacre.
Right, like that.
Tombstone Stairwell.
Right, so that sort of deck will get rewarded, I think, disproportionately to how they would in a more level or consistent context, because there's so much variance in cEDH. So Azorius, which is very consistent, will just, if you have a very consistent deck, every game, someone's going to be performing above average and they're going to win, not you. Even if your actual average is like theoretically a little bit higher.
Right. Oh, that makes sense. Cobble.
I mean, I think that's well said. I don't know if I come to the same conclusion. I think that part of the equation is also the pool of commanders that are available. So you've got the cards that are in that color spectrum, but you also need to have somebody who's at the helm that can be a consistent, bringer of advantage to whatever deck it is that you're going to build. And even though Tymna, I mean, we've kind of bridged this already, where Tymna is the undisputed best Orzhov commander, but because it has partner, there's almost no incentive not to expand beyond that color range. So the choice to stay in Orzhov generally means that you're either not using Tymna or you're using Tymna with, Tevesh or something like that. And I think that accounts for its underrepresentation in the metagame. And I agree that Orzhov will be more spiky just because it has access to things like Adnaz and Necro, and will have random moments when it's able to have very fast out of nowhere wins. But I mean, even in that case, I mean, the win cons for Orzhov are not great. And admittedly, the win cons in Azorius are also not great.
I'd say they're better than the win cons in Azorius, honestly.
Right. But Azorius's ability to interact early and stop others from winning out from under them is much, much more consistent than Orzhov's ability to do so. I mean, if you've got Orzhov and somebody turn 2 plays Cody, or, just slams Oracle and Consult, I mean, you've got Angel's Grace and that's kind of it. Whereas
You could
in
mana tithe
Azorius.
them if you really wanted to.
For the people running Mana Tithe, sure. But, Azorius, they actually have a decent likelihood of being able to interact with that and be able to make it to that longer game. So I don't think it's cut and dry, and I don't think it's an absolute in one direction or the other.
Well, so I think this is where you're sort of describing my empirical view on Azorius, and my holistic view on Azorius, and then the issue is that the games where you counter an Adnaz on turn 3, you need to have a sufficiently high conversion rate on those for it to be worth it for you to not just take the chances that you die and cast your own Adnaz, right? Like if you counter the Adnaz 100% of the time and then go on to win 20% of those games versus you just roll the dice and 25% of the time you Naz first and you win, and then the rest of the time you just die, like 25% is more than 20%. And I think the issue is the empirical issue is that Azorius's consistent disruption can't be converted into wins from advantaged positions consistently enough to actually make it outperform Orzhov.
We should probably open it up to the comments.
Yeah.
Let us know. Orzhov or Azorius? Which
Tell me
is
why
worse?
I'm an idiot for playing Azorius.
The problem is the comments section are going to be destroyed by my takes later on in the episode. So,
Oh boy.
There we go.
this conversation's going to get buried.
So when we look at the next piece here, this is one that you should probably know pretty well, Morgan, is Golgari. So when we look at Golgari, I think the deck that I immediately think of is Viral's Hulk, right? I feel like that's probably, or Mirren is also.
Gitrog?
I guess. Oh yeah, I guess Gitrog is a black green. I'm trying to avoid
Might be
talking
the
about
most-
Gitrog after the last time it came up on our show.
Let's not get into that. I think certainly historically Gitrog has been the most played Golgari commander. It's in a bit of a rough spot. It's in a much better spot now that Hullbreacher's banned, because that card looks like it was designed by someone who played Notion Thief and still lost a frog and got mad salty about it. And they were like, okay, here's what we're going to do. First, you're not going to draw the cards because then they can't try and deck you out at instant speed. Second, it's going to have 2 toughness, which makes it a lot harder to remove. Third, it's going to be 3 mana, so it's easier to cast. But
That's salty.
It was a spite design.
it's actually, I mean, I guess if it had 3 toughness, then you couldn't kill it with a Cabal Pit. That's like the only concession they made to that, to not just actually killing Gitrog outright. I think that I think commander-centric strategies and so Gitrog was always a deck that tried to win second, or usually a deck that tried to win second. And what that meant was somebody else would try and cast an Adnod. You'd cast Gitrog and just pass. And someone would cast Adnaz, it'd get countered, there'd be a flurry of interaction, and then you'd untap, and then you'd just have it, and usually having it looked like presenting some very difficult to counter things. Like, if the threatening card you're casting is a wild mongrel, guess what? There's actually not a lot of things that people are playing that deal with that, right? It can't be dispelled, can't be guardianshipped or swatted. Generally, it doesn't die. The removal has to hit whichever piece comes down first, which is often the Gitrog monster, which is a tall ask, right? Trying to abrupt decay the discard outlet often doesn't work. They can just go off over top. So it was very well positioned at doing that and abusing people who were greedy and tried to win, and then you just win immediately after. I think that as decks have gotten faster, the conversion rate on those super early wins has gone up. They tend to happen. The super fast player also tends to be trying to win on turn 2, not turn 3 now. And I think that that's made Frog just a little bit worse. It also hasn't gotten some of the new tools that make Adnaz decks a lot better, namely Dockside and Breach. Not things Gitrog can play.
You don't say.
The printing, it doesn't do particularly well against Opposition Agent. It's a deck that really likes to tutor. It doesn't do...
Also doesn't do well against Douthy.
Doesn't do well against Douthy. Yes, you can play those cards, but they do more against you than they do for you. And so, I think it's just a deck that's been falling and falling. Varel's Hulk is still a decently fast deck, but it's much less... it used to be that it was, ever so slightly slower than the fastest decks. Maybe Food Chain was a little bit faster, or... I don't know, Grenzo might have been a little bit faster, things like that. But you had much more resilient wins because you were, doing Hulk nonsense. But now you're, a lot slower than the faster decks. You almost never turn 2. And even the turn 3s are, they're not incredibly uncommon, but if your play pattern is, land Dork, land Varals, getting Hulk into the bin and reanimating it on turn 3 is not, super consistent. And it doesn't necessarily have the greatest pivots into slower plans because you just have absolutely no value in the command zone. You're playing a 3-mana sack outlet in the command zone because you want a sack outlet. I guess we sort of dove into commanders initially, but evaluating these commanders in the context of what Golgari gives you, so you as I was saying, you get sort of these medium fast decks. They're capable of going fast, but they're certainly not as fast as the red-based ones.
Right.
And that's, you get a little bit more consistency with your Dork-based mana base, which also gives you some resilience to Null Rods. You still have the rituals, you still have Nas and things like that. The creatures generally layer pretty nicely with the various reanimation and graveyard tools. So a lot of the decks, other than Gitrog specifically, tended to they have some sort of reanimation-based combo. You get access to a few different sort of stacksy elements, but not enough to really consistently be presenting them unless you're dedicating a huge amount of your deck and going a little bit deep on them. We've seen some of the Marin lists do. You get the green-black removal. You're lacking in stack-based disruption. In fact, arguably you have the least to say about your opponent having some threatening card on the stack. White, well, it doesn't have counterspells, at least gets things like Silence. Red gets Blasts. Blue obviously gets
Flecting
counterspells. Blast and Swat, yeah. Black and green get almost nothing. Pretty much all of their interaction is only for protecting themselves with effects.
They also have pretty solid removal though.
Yes, they do have removal, but in terms of an Adnaz on the stack,
right?
You're not only can you not stop it, you also can't even get involved, right? A red deck can't stop it, but they can back up your Dispel with a Pyroblast or a SWAT. A white deck can silence you to buy the table a turn. A Golgari deck can do nothing, more or less.
In the world where there was no Thassa's Oracle and the best options were Labman or Lab Jace, Golgari was able to interact with that win con.
Yes.
But Golgari has nothing at all that it can do against Oracle Consultation.
Pretty much.
Which is a bad place to be.
There's some
Oracle.
Absolutely terrible instant speed black targeted draw spells. But if you're going to play a 3 mana draw 2 card so you can deck your opponents with their Oracle trigger on the stack,
not a good place to be in.
Enjoy. So I think Golgari, I would say Golgari is probably one of the worst positioned color combinations right now, even if I think it's actually a decent, like, holistically in the 2 color combinations, I think it's actually one of the stronger ones. But I think the things that it does, there is like not a lot of room in the meta for them right now.
Right.
The window where you try and win, after someone's been disrupted, or like a little bit slower than the fastest decks with a little bit more resiliency, like that window is very, very narrow. And you do still struggle. Like you can win through rule of law, but the decks generally like struggle to assemble and set up their wins to win through rule of law through a rule of law. Sorry, that was kind of a weird way of phrasing it, but so I think that it's a color combination that certainly could come back into the sun with some meta shifts, but I think right now is suffering.
It's interesting, Cobble, when we talk about it, because I know that we've talked about before that on the show that, and even today, that like Gitrog is not as well positioned as it used to be, but I know there is a growing number of people who are starting to play more Grave Hate. Does that really make the position for really all Golgari? Because I mean, really where it comes down to it is all Golgari decks win through the graveyard to some extent. Is that like inaccurate to say?
Okay,
excuse me.
I would say
they have Witherbloom combo. I apologize.
I mean, there is Witherbloom combo, but the Shadow Bag apparatus, which doesn't really get any play, is able to win through rule of law. Because
I specifically like Rest in Peace,
right,
those
Rest in Peace is what I meant to say. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Forgive me. Just because of some of the
replacement effects.
Yes. So, but that's really, kind of getting down into minutia. It's still discarding cards and then recurring them and using that for advantage. So
right.
I don't know of any wins that are. I'm trying to think of something that doesn't use the graveyard that's in Golgari. So thinking of things like Hepatra plus Yawgmoth or Meat Hook Massacre or a Blood Artist or one of those effects. I mean, generally the way that you win with those is by recurring something in and out of the graveyard. So I mean, Finale of Devastation.
Okay.
Somehow making infinite mana and killing everybody with Finale of Devastation. That's kind of the out. And generally Golgari's good.
In green-black is often surprisingly tricky without using specifically Necrotic Ooze, which doesn't do much through Rest in Peace.
Doesn't work. Yeah.
So, needless to say, like, where do we kind of feel Golgari falls overall? Like, is it something that right now we're trying to, like, if you were, picking decks that you're trying to play right now, is it something that you're probably trying to avoid, or what do you think, Morgan?
I think right now I would lean towards trying to avoid it, not because I don't think that it has a reasonable tool set or a valuable niche, but I think in the meta that we're currently seeing, it's very poorly positioned. That being said, I think we might be transitioning towards a meta where it's a little bit better positioned, particularly doing things like Hulk is very strong in the face of people starting to lean into anti-turbo stacks. Like, if you're playing a Hulk deck and someone plays a Rule of Law, you just rub your hands together with glee. And like,
thank you for protecting my win.
Yeah, like it's very, and a lot of the rule of law decks have accepted as a sacrifice that they're going to be slow, and they're not necessarily going to have, they're going to play their early stacks pieces, and then they're not necessarily going to have a lot of, like stack based or more reactive disruption effects. And so if you can find a line through the stacks that's being presented against you, it becomes very, very easy for your deck to win.
Right.
Which is why more people need to run Grafdigger's Cage, Rest in Peace, go back to running Mind Sensor, maybe even Containment Priest.
Containment Priest is an interesting card. I don't know.
Sorry, I shouldn't have started this on Golgari.
It's its own thing, but no, that's interesting. Next up is probably one of the cards that, or one of the not cards, the
colors.
Pairings?
Geez. Color pairings that might contend for some of the best, maybe not quite as good as blue black, but it's definitely up there, Cobble, and that's Simic. And so when we look at this, we're talking Kinnan and Tatiova and, Kodama Sakashima. What are we really seeing here
Edric.
with Simic? And Edric, yeah. Okay, sorry. I did miss that in our show notes.
Are
we talking
the MLC?
I apologize, LJ.
LJ had some manner of success with Edric in that. So,
blue green. What are we talking about with Simic here?
So, it's got great stack interaction because of the blue. It's got great creature tutors because of the green, and it's got decent ramp that is insulated from Null Rod in the dorks that it's got, and it's got reasonable card advantage through Remora and Rhystic Study, and it has Thrasios and Kinnan and various other ways of generating card advantage if you're able to produce lots of mana. And Simic is very good at producing lots of mana, whether it's by, comboing Kinnan with Basalt Monolith and, anything, or what are some of the other, Freed from the Real plus any of the Bloom Tender kind of dorks. Those sort of things. Generate infinite mana, pump it into whichever outlet you have, right, and then draw your deck and then win with Oracle or in some other means. The Kodama Sakashima is a really interesting, I'll say, outlier, because it does not look at all like any lists. It's effectively Simic Godo.
I remember last year when HISP won with that deck, and you and I were looking at the deck list when they were going into the finals, and we're like, this looks like a casual deck.
Right. It's got a high CMC, and it's capitalizing on a very niche interaction that you can get if you're able to maintain 2 Kodamas on the battlefield. And it is just like Godo. It's a race to 10 or a race to 11, depending on. And if you get there, then you just kind of win if people don't know how to interact with it. And it's a really interesting take. And it reveals some level of flexibility and diversity inside what you can do with Simic, besides just go infinite with mana and pump it into Thrasios or Kinnan. So, I think that there is some amount of exploration that people can do. Tatiova is very similar, where instead of trying to go real fast, it's playing more of a land-based game. And, if you can kill people with Cloudstone Curio and Sun-Scorched Desert, then, you're doing something right. Because that's difficult to interact with unless someone has removal.
Right.
And as far as weaknesses, I would say that, it has great creature tutoring, but for the cases where your combo requires an enchantment, which, is common for things like Freed from the Real or, artifacts. I mean, you've got some artifact in Transmute Artifact and Whir of Invention and that kind of thing, but it's not super deep. So if you're trying to grab something that isn't a creature, you don't have a lot of depth and you don't have a lot of consistency. So the lack of the black tutors is felt really strongly.
When you see that like in Kinnan, right? When they're trying to assemble the mirror lines.
Right. It's so there's a balance. It's able to go reasonably fast, and it's able to not only defend itself, but it's able to interact with the table. But assembling the combos is somewhat slower because it can't either tutor for it or do a Nas to just draw half of their deck and then put together their combo.
Right.
So beyond that, most of its draw is actually draw rather than so Adnaz and Necro are not draw effects. So They don't care about Narset or Notion Thief or those types of things. So Narset and Notion Thief, people who are running Turbo Nas, they don't really care about them for the most part because that just generally hoses Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study. But for the case of Simic, I mean, that really puts a damper on what they're trying to do because a lot of their card advantage is actually draw.
Right.
So, and a lot of their removal is bounce removal. So if you can't remove a threat and then immediately win, you don't have a lot of staying power against people just kind of replaying stuff unless you happen to have a very full grip and lots of counter spells.
Right. So, Morgan, you have lots of experience playing up against Kinnan, as we play against Pongo fairly frequently. So when you look at Simic and we kind of try to look at where it falls within all the colored pairings, where do you kind of think it sits in that hierarchy?
I think that this is another one that's somewhat poorly positioned right now, but has decently strong tools available. I think what's currently holding it back a lot is the inability to support the hate it gets in its colors, which is basically most Simic decks can't play Collector Roof.
Right.
Edric is something of an exception there. But looking at the others, Kinnan is an artifact combo deck. And then things like Sakadama and Tatiova are 5 mana, and you have to cast them. So playing Collector Roof
artifacts
is I mean, Tatiova's 5 mana, Kodama is 6 followed by 4. To get them down early, you don't want to be hating out artifacts generally. I mean, I also think we left the best Simic commander off this list in the form of Thrasios, Triton Hero, partnered with whoever. Again, typically you're going to be wanting to do things like Scepter stuff, which, like, Bloom Tender Free from the Real is obviously, it sort of fits nicer in your colors, except for the fact that the way you find
has an enchantment.
Freed from the Real is you
Drift of Phantasms.
Drift of Phantasms for it, exactly. Which, yikes.
Feels great.
So, like, these decks are generally trying to play artifacts, which means they can't play oof, but they're slower than, say, like, red-black based artifact abusing decks. And so that creates kind of a struggle for them where it can be difficult for them to execute on their strategies and plans under the hate that stops the faster decks. And so then they have to stunt their development to try and control those faster decks by, holding up interaction on early turns, which is not necessarily ideal. And if somebody else plays like a Null Rod, countering it is like often just suicidal if there's a Turbonos deck at the table. Like spending your interaction to stop the Turbonos player from being disrupted is a great way to lose. So then you're like, well, I guess I have to let this resolve, but then your play through it isn't great. And so I think that like you have to fall back on 1-for-1 interaction, which we've discussed to death why that's not an optimal strategy in a 4-player free-for-all environment.
The dorks do provide some amount of insulation from the Null Rod effects in general. They, as stated before, if your commander's 5 mana or more, you're going to need to supplement your dorks with additional stuff if you want to reliably be able to get them out early. But having a Null Rod in play is less disruptive to Simic than it is to a Turbonos deck.
It's less disruptive, but I think most of the Simic decks that currently exist, it's still too disruptive. Like, if Tygam was Simic, for example, I think that would be incredible because he's 4 mana, so he's a little bit more reasonable. Like, you play some acceleration on turn 1 and 2, you cast him on turn 3, you could possibly even be holding up mana. And then you have this piece that makes your counter spells really good, and you can then sort of build from there, even acknowledging the fact that Tygam's combos are generally quite mana intensive, and you probably would want artifacts. But with things like Tatiova, even if you're like playing her on turn 3, you probably aren't doing anything with her on turn 3, and then. Like, if you just use dork-based acceleration to get her out, then you have to set up the synergy pieces as well. Maybe you do that first, so then you're looking at, like, turns 1 and 2, you're accelerating. Turn 3, you play out, you find and play your Azusa or whatever it is. Turn 4, you're playing Tatiova, then maybe you can replay some lands, or you got your Crucible or whatever on turn 3, and you can replay a land. And then by the time you untap with her, we're talking about, like... By the time you untap with Tatiova... One of Tatiova's big synergy pieces, you're looking at, assuming you can't use artifact mana, you're probably looking at turn 4 or 5 most of the time. And I think that's just
not a great place to be.
Quite good enough when you don't have your own static disruptive tools to help supplement and bridge the gap to those turns. I don't think these decks are terrible. I think these decks are fine and currently poorly positioned.
But Kinnon's still a good deck, right?
Kinnon is still reasonable. We can ask Pongo about it.
Dear Pongo, what is your opinion of Kinnon? Looking at another blue-based strategy that kind of runs into sort of similar issues, but has red, so everybody's high on it, is blue and red. So Morgan, when we're looking at Izzet, this is kind of the classic Storm color. You think of Izzet in Modern, right? Izzet Storm in Modern's like the Storm deck. So when we look at it here, though, what does it kind of look like? I know now we've got Krakashima, which is probably the closest thing to that you got, but what all are we talking about?
So there's a few different sort of brews in the Simic space. There's always been some variety of Niv Mizzet deck ever since he was spoiled. He's an incredible value engine, and he can't be countered. So those are two things that make him like very appealing if you want to play kind of a control type deck. And he also is reasonably disruptive. I think people often underestimate like how disruptive.
I think we saw that in the MLC when Timmy would land Niv Mizzet, and then
and then it's just
the board just goes, oh.
Yeah. And even like the fact that you can sometimes leverage that into built-in Gilded Drake protection. I think Gilded Drake is like an unreasonably large issue for him. And I would love to play like a Torpor Orb, but casting Niv Mizzet without Dockside is pretty rough a lot of the time because blue, 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 red, red, red.
Let me tell you about Magda.
I mean, yeah, again, I mean, I guess she does make treasures. You know, you can play your Captain Lannery Storm if you really want to go deep. Actually, I think Stormkiln Artist is also a big thing in those types of decks. Especially something like Niv where you're just playing like a billion instants and sorceries.
Turns Flusterstorm into a ritual.
Particularly when your deck goes very deep on free cast instant and sorcery, Stormkiln Artist is a house. And obviously it's absurd with Krark, but
yeah.
But
everything's absurd with
like
Krark.
Yeah, trying to like landing Niv Mizzet is an issue. There's various Malcolm decks. People have done Malcolm Breaches just to get some value. There's Malcolm Kedis, where you have this incredible mana engine because you get 3 treasures if you have Kedis out and you swing with Malcolm. And then you just polymorph into the Glinthorn combo. But while that combo does work through Rule of Law, Izzet decks don't play well through Rule of Law as a general rule. And it doesn't work.
You don't say.
It's like, it's really rough to play a creatureless deck that dies to Curse Totem. Like, that's just so sad. And that combo, the Glinthorn Malcolm combo, dies to any sort of draw hate, Notion Thief, Chains of Mephistopheles, or whatever, Spirit of the Labyrinth. It dies to creature ability hate and artifact hate. And I think that's just a little bit rough.
Remember when we were talking about blue black and we're like, what's all the stuff that hates on Thoracle? This is like the opposite problem.
Yeah. And then in Izzet, you're lacking tutors for things that aren't instants and sorceries and creatures with specific caveats. You have like goblin tutors and recruiters and wizard cycling and stuff like that, but like you don't have get whatever creature I want type tutors, which means, and even the instant and sorcery tutors, you often don't have a huge number of them. Like, so there's, Spellseeker, Mystical Tutor, Gamble, then you got your Spellseeker, Merchant Scroll, Solve the Equation, and then you're getting pretty deep if you're going any deeper than that. You can try and make intuition stuff work. It's a little bit rough in Izzet when you don't have a card like Savine's Reclamation, and you just generally don't have fantastic access to cards out of your graveyard. Some Izzet decks have tried to do Past in Flame stuff. It's very mana intensive. Typically that's for like Vadrik or Mizzix who have built-in discounts.
Mizzix Mastery.
Yeah, you can do Mizzix Mastery stuff, but even then, your 3-card pile is like some, like, are you playing like a Call to Mind, or you can do like Mystic Retrieval or something like that. And then like if you're trying to bin and Enter the Infinite, like I guess maybe you can do like Mystic Retrieval, Faithless. No, there's probably a pile that I'm just derping on right now that could consistently Mizzix Mastery and Enter the Infinite from your graveyard, but it's not.
But it would be a pile.
It would very much be a pile. And so like you suffer for not being able to necessarily find your win conditions. You don't have the black tutors. While Izzet is like a storm color combination in Modern, when you look at Legacy, Storm decks typically play black, and that's because the old rituals, the truly busted rituals, were black, and you don't necessarily get those well, you don't get those in Is It. And so...
But is it good?
Is it good? Not exactly. So yeah, you have your breach combos, but the only tutor that really enables it is Gamble. I mean, I guess you can do Fervent Mastery. So there's just like a lot of issues with the color combination that make it. Everything's just like a little bit more awkward than you want, and to top it all off, for whatever reason, a lot of the commanders don't curve nicely. So
no, they do not.
So 3 mana, 2 color commanders are awkward to cast when you don't have dorks, because if you're playing a 2 mana rock, then you have to play it on turn 2. You play your commander on turn 3. If you have something like a Soul Ring, you still can't play it turn 1. So that's Riel. That's Vadrik. That's oh my god, there's like, but there was another one that I thought of, and now it's just gone from my head. But yeah, Riel. Sure. Like that's things like Riel and Vadrik. Krark and Sakashima, well, like you can play Krark on 2. If you play, assuming you don't have fast mana, if you play Krark on 2, you can't play Sakashima on 3. So now you're looking at playing her on 4, and then it's hard to go off with very limited mana after it. So like it's definitely a color combination where like you really want the fast mana. And that's not like, you don't have the tutors to find it. You don't have like the E-tutor, Vamp tutor. I'll just go grab my Crypt super early tutors. Obviously you can gamble for Crypt, but that's always a risky play.
Right.
And burning your gamble in a breach combo deck for a Crypt is often very rough. So you sort of struggle in establishing yourself early a lot of the time. And I think that definitely holds the color combination back, in concert with dying to the same hate that like Grixis dies to, without getting all of the absolute nonsense that Grixis gets.
So let me ask you this then. So we've talked about Zadrik, we've talked about Mizzix, we've talked about Krark and Sakashima and Niv Mizzet, all these things. Joyra obviously would be in there as well. Which of these commanders do we feel like, if we're playing blue-red, this is probably where we want to be?
I think that empirically it's Krark and Sakashima, because that's a deck that gives your opponents a lot of opportunities, first of all, to make mistakes and not interact correctly, but also just sometimes you can't interact favorably against that deck. Like if you're trying to stop Krark and Sakashima with like dispels and swan songs and miscasts, like you're just gonna have such a bad time. And if you're then you're looking at trying to keep Krark or Sakashima off the field. The dream is to kill Krark with Sakashima on the stack, but that often is not a line that's available to you without a decent amount of sacrifice. Chaining it is like pretty underwhelming. I guess you could do that. Decks that play swords can do that. Otherwise, you're looking at holding up like Abrupt Decay on like an early turn, which is not necessarily, for like not a winning play, it's probably not where you want to be. But it is a deck that reward or punishes your opponents and takes advantage of certain play patterns most effectively. I think that I don't know which of the ones I think is it might be Vadrik. Lyndon Noobzor has played Riel for a while. He was actually considering taking it to tier 1 con, and it definitely it certainly did a bunch of good stuff a lot of the time. It's definitely a deck that and like Riel can present a very real clock in games that get even a little bit stalled. it's definitely a deck that had some issues in the consistency department and in the commander reliance department. That one wasn't bad. I tested, or like goldfishing Vadric has been very interesting. I'm not sure where I rate it compared to Mizzix. I think it's a little bit less wild than Mizzix.
I've gotten to play against it a couple times. It seems like it gets to play like a few better cards.
Yeah.
Than like not a whole lot better cards, but like a handful of, like, you're not playing Fire Mines Research, right? Like
Haze of Rage.
I mean, yeah, Fire Mines Insight is, or Fire Mines,
yeah, it's
Foresight. Fire Mines Foresight.
Foresight, that's right.
Is, I mean, like, I would certainly say that having quote unquote one card combos that are instants or sorceries is a feature of Mizzix, not a bug, even if those cards on their own don't look great. Both Invert Invent and Fire Mines Foresight are like some of the things that make Mizzix actually a good deck, because then you are like that one Mystical Tutor, Merchant Scroll, solve the equation away from just winning the game once you get like that sort of setup enabled. And Vadric generally needs like 2 or 3 cards to win the game. The fact that he is an immediate discounter that doesn't need to be enabled and costs 3, not 4, is big. So I don't exactly, it's like, they certainly have advantages and disadvantages over each other.
I'll settle it for you. The best Izzet commander is Crom.
I mean,
we've talked about Tymna in Thrasios.
Yeah, Crom is not Tymna. It's really, really not. For like a lot of reasons.
I definitely agree with you.
Like a lot of reasons.
But I would still say it's probably one of the best blue-red commanders.
I would disagree. I don't think like Tymna solo is not like enticing to play because you don't have to play her solo, but like is playable, and I think Crom solo is not.
Okay,
and I think
that's fair.
I think one of the sort of indicators of that is that we've seen a lot of 3-color Tymna decks, and not nearly the same variety of 3-color Crom decks. Like, people have done Crom Thrasios. Obviously, Tavesh Crom was done, but like Grixis could literally play without a commander and be fine. Whereas, like, we've seen all of the possible 3-color Tymna decks having typically multiple different partner considerations in each of the 3-color combinations, and strategy diversity, and where, like, we've seen the Abzan farm and stacks deck. We've seen the Esper Turbo Naz stacks, sort of tempo mid-range stuff with both Sakashima and Malcolm. In red, typically we're only seeing turbo decks, but we're seeing them with Rograk and Jeska. And we just don't see that same sort of 3-color pairing with Crom.
Yeah. Does Crom have a plus white deck that's been established?
I'm pretty sure there was a Jeskai Crom deck that at least was submitted to the database. I don't think
I've seen Crom Bruce before.
You can do Crom Bruce and just slap people. You can also do Crom Ishai and just have 2 slappers rather than 1 double striking slapper. I think both of those sort of suffer from wanting to, like, landing Crom is like not a plan the way that landing Tymna is, because the card draw is just so much more, or so much less consistent. I was going to say more inconsistent, but like, I've certainly seen, I'll confess, I've enjoyed the games where someone has gone like for some crazy dump my entire hand and slam Crom, and then on like turn 1, and then everyone's like, cool, I'm gonna play one spell and pass. Like, I'm gonna play land Dork, land Timna, and then this person played a Crom, and it's like on turn 1, and it's turn 3, and they have like 2 cards in hand and like 2 or 3 mana because they used Mana Vault or whatever, Jeweled Lotus, and you're just
and then
like,
someone plays Rule of Law.
or even if they don't, you're just like, how well did that work out for you? Like, whereas, early Timnas, first of all, they don't require nearly the same sacrifice. And second of all, even if they don't have as high a theoretical ceiling, they're going to draw you cards.
Right. Timna is more autonomous, whereas Crom is more parasitic.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think there's a lot of people who, and okay, to push back on the Crom thing a little bit here, just for the sake of conversation. Could you make the same argument on, I expand resources to play a mana or to get a Ristic Study out on turn 1. I've done the thing, and turn 3, nobody's paid, or everybody has paid for this Ristic Study. Could you not make that same argument there?
No, you
because
couldn't, because everyone paid 1 mana on it. You cast a one-sided sphere of resistance rather than a 4.
But in a format where everybody's wanting to go fast, right, and everybody's wanting to play multiple spells a turn,
right,
is having a card out that people are respecting, where they're going, we're not going to play multiple spells a turn.
Well,
actively acting as a sort of stacks piece.
I think that it's very different to. So, yes, to an extent. There is some, you could say that Crom is the lightest possible stacks piece. But in terms, like, there are lots of decks that are totally happy to just play their 1 spell for turn on turns like 2 and 3 and just, we're going to take this game slow, we're going to be chill, whatever.
Right.
And the one deck that's not happy about that, like the turbo whatever deck, feeds you 1 card a turn.
Right.
Whereas with Ristic Study, generally the one deck that's like, okay, sure, they're going to play Dork into Timna or whatever, and I'm going to, or like they played the Dork, then the Ristic Study came down, they're going to play Thrasios followed by Timna or whatever. You're going to play a tutor followed by their 3 or 4 mana commander, extrapolate this, whatever. I'm just using Timna as like an easy.
No, I get what you're saying.
The deck that's like, I will lose this game, I can't play that plan, can often wind up feeding you 2, 3, 4 cards in a turn with a Ristic Study. Whereas they can literally, it's impossible for them to feed you more than 1 card in a turn with a Crom. Like, that's just not how Crom works. And
unless there's a counter war.
Well, one person can only feed you 1 card a turn. Obviously, multiple people could theoretically feed you cards in a turn. I also think that Ristic Study, when it draws the most cards, is counter wars. Because often what people will do, like sort of the greedy but respectful line with Ristic Study, is that you pay for all the spells you cast on your turn, and you hold up interaction that you can't pay for, hoping that you don't have to use it. That's often a heuristic that I'll apply through a Ristic Study. I'll hold up my Dispel, but I'll only hold up 1 mana. If I need to Dispel, the Ristic Study player's getting a card, like, oh well. And I think that, with Crom, in order to draw cards, you need them to have like multiple pieces of interaction that they're spending all on 1 turn. And like basically every situation that Crom is in the early game that Crom's drawing you cards, Ristic Study would have drawn you more cards, requiring less of an investment to get onto the field.
Right.
And I think in the situations where it doesn't draw you cards, it's still way more disruptive than Crom. So
I would agree with that. I do want to point out, I do agree with you on this. I just want to push back a little bit.
Sure.
You know?
Sure.
Esper Sentinel is a better rate.
Yeah. Okay. It's I think it's a materially different card. It's a card that's
right.
I've seen it be a very effective tax piece a lot of the time, more so than a card draw engine. But I have seen it be a pretty impressive card draw engine too.
Well, moving on here to the last little bit, and I think we're going to have some opinions here on this. We were talking about this before the show, and Boros has really looked a lot. Regardless of opinions about Boros, right? We can all kind of agree that Boros now is much more compelling than it was 2 years ago. And that is, for a variety of reasons. But when we look at this Cobblepott and we look at Boros, we've seen Winota have this string of success recently. It's kind of the hot new stacks deck that people are playing. What is going on with Boros? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? And ultimately, what do we think about it?
Well, I think part of the metamorphosis that's happened for Boros over the past 2 years is the improvement of red and things like Jessica's Will, things like Deflecting SWAT and so on, and Dockside Extortionist. Those are all things that kind of raise all boats. So anything with red in its identity is going to be benefiting from those cards. Boros was starting from a much lower point than all of the other red X combinations. So the fact that it has become a present entity within the metagame is, I think it had to come further than the other color combinations had to. But then again, it was coming from practically nothing. And I think the stronger force involved in this is really the commanders that got printed. So Winota, of course, and Cole to some degree, because I think Sick has demonstrated that has some amount of legs and consistency. But really, I don't think that the success of Boros would be happening without the printing of Winota. Even though red has improved Boros, the reason why Boros is a thing is because of Winota. With any other commander, it just would not be seeing the same amount of success. And that's because of the fact that it's both a card advantage engine and a resource engine, because it's effectively drawing you cards and allowing you to play them without casting them, and breaking parity with its own rule of law effects and with its own blood moon effects and so on. So it winds up being able to play a very stacks-oriented, proactive game while completely breaking parity with that because of the commander. Whereas other paradigms where people are trying to play rule of law or to play artifact hate or any other symmetric kind of hate piece, they have to work to be able to break parity with that symmetric hate. And Winota in the command zone is the parity breaker.
Right.
And the card advantage engine and the resource engine. So it's kind of the best thing that Boros could have ever gotten. And if it was in another color combination, it would be even more insane. I think the fact that it's in Boros and it's so powerful. I mean, if Winota was black-white or blue-white, I mean, that would be a very different
Thanks for
circumstance.
playing, Lavinia. We'll talk to you later.
But all of that said, I mean, Boros generally has very little going for it because it has almost no stack interaction, short of the deflecting SWAT and silence effects. It, generally, because its game plan is going to be very proactive and permanent oriented, it's going to fold to Cyclonic Rift and generally will take longer to recoup post-wipe than most other lists because most other lists are lower to the ground. The tutor support is not great. You've got Gamble and you've got Enlightened Tutor and kind of it. And, but beyond Winota, the card advantage options are like Esper Sentinel and maybe Wheels. I mean, there's just not very much depth at all. And that was why Boros was always so far behind all of the other color combinations. Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, really is a testament to how powerful and broken Winota actually is to be able to remediate all of those shortcomings and be able to lead to a deck that is able to compete at the highest echelons.
So when we're talking about this deck, and we're talking about this deck has seen some amount of success recently and is kind of becoming popular. Spleen, when we look at this card and we look at where it is and we look at what the Winota deck is doing, moving forward, where do you think this deck is going to be landing? Because I think you said this earlier before we went on air, is you think we're kind of in a little bit of like a honeymoon phase with Winota at the moment.
Yeah. So remember when I said the comment section was going to be destroyed? One of the notes we have here under Boros is that it's not the worst anymore. I disagree. I still believe it's the worst color combination.
Even worse than like Azorius?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that we're talking about two Boros commanders. Cole is like, it kind of works because it is as if someone was like trying to design a commander based on like all of the strengths that are like exactly Boros's. It's like, okay, you can play like a bunch of these like cheap, easy to die creatures, and then you can find equipment consistently and nothing else. Like that's what Boros has going for it. So we'll make a commander that just like combos with Skull Clamp and like some minor enablers. And so it can do some surprising things, but I think even Sick Robot, who spent a lot of time with the deck, would say that like it has very material weaknesses.
Like Lavinia.
Sure, but like more generally, any sort of stacks, Null Rod, Rule of Law, Torpor Orb, Rest in Peace, like a lot of things give it a hard time. It's also a deck that a lot of its success comes from trying to present the actual piece of your combo that needs to be interacted with too early for people to interact with, and part of that relies on inexperience. Mm-hmm. Like when you just tutor and cast the Skull Clamp on like turn 2, and you're like, you don't even have Cole in play, and they're like, well, you're not comboing. Why would I care? You let the Skull Clamp resolve, and then it's like, okay, we're now 2 turns later, they've cast the Cole, and now I'm forced with either dying or I have to counter this like freaking Memnite or whatever. Like the Kobolds of Care keep on the stack, and you're like, I have to counter this or we lose.
It's awful. It's the
so
worst.
awful. And then so setting aside Cole, Winota, Yes, I said I think we're in a bit of a honeymoon phase. I don't know how many of our listeners will remember when Bloodpod sort of first hit the scene. It was before the dominance of Hulk, and people were still very much in like a Nas focused mindset. This was the time of like, at the time it was PST, Paradox Scepter Thrasios. Even things like,
It was before Dockside.
like Doomtide, Grenzo Doomsday, Chainveil Teferi. Like a lot of these were like the top decks, and like Hulk existed. Razaketh's didn't, because like Razaketh had just been printed and people hadn't sort of figured that shell out as much. So like Hulk existed, and it was like, okay, yeah, Breakfast Hulk is a good deck, but Breakfast Hulk was also a very clunky Hulk deck. Particularly, like it was playing Nas, it was trying to go really fast, so it was still decently vulnerable to stacks. And you went into this meta where everyone was playing Nas. Everyone was like trying to go fast, rituals, fast mana, Nas, all of these things. And then you just went like, yeah, cool. Turn to Null Rod. I'll play like actual rule of law. I'll play Thalia. And it was like, people thought it was like unbeatable. People had all these greedy mana bases. It was like, we're playing Blood Moon too. Like, just all of this. It went on an absolute tear in like some of the ranked leagues in particular, putting up, like people were putting up like 50, 60% win rates with it. And then it just started to fall, and like it fell for 2 years straight. And then it bottomed out as like a meme of like an unplayable deck, because the hate that it was presenting just no longer lined up against the meta, which was at the time Hulk. And people tried to sort of revive it. There were like the Metapod lists and things where it was like, okay, we'll go lighter on the tax effects and the rule of laws, and we'll lean into things like Rest in Peace and Cage. And those saw a little bit of success, but like in a meta that was not like playing perfectly into it, it was very much not a successful deck. And I think Winota has been showing up and just like clapping all of these greedy Nas decks, and that's great. Like, to be clear, I'm really happy about that, and I think it's a very healthy thing. But if we look at the last two sort of big public tournaments, both of which had a Winota deck in the top 4, the decks that they lost to were decks that I think they have a really hard time beating. So that was Minsk Hulk, and it was Killstar's Hermit Pod Brew. Like, it was a Staxy deck that was playing just more consistent win cons than Winota could really hope to deal with, that were stacks resilient. And I think that those decks have always been a part of the meta, and Winota is going to have like a terrible win rate against those decks. Not like I think Winota's win rate against decks that can consistently win through stacks is a lot worse than like Turbonaz deck's win rate against Winota, for example. Because you just don't have the tools to deal with them. Like Turbonaz decks, sometimes you can just get under the Winota. Like they don't have, you have the turn 2 and they didn't have like a turn 1 deafening silence. Or they curve like some attacker into like turn 2 Winota, and they swing and they don't hit like, they don't hit Ranger Captain or Sanctum Prelate or Thalia. And so like, congratulations, you can win on turn 3 or whatever. And like things like pod decks or like Yisan has always been held up as like a deck that just absolutely, like, that was the joke. The joke with Blood Pod was that you just handed games to the Najila or Yisan player, like back when Yisan also saw a lot of play. And I think that is going to be true of Winota, and it will stumble when we see those decks, and those decks are viable enough that there'll be enough of them. My own tournament experiences playing against Winota, I've seen it die in a huge number of pods to some deck that could combo through its stacks. It was Hullen, it was Hermit Pod, it was Hulk decks, it was any number, some Reanimator type decks. And I don't think it, and I think because Boros is such a limited color combination, I just don't think that there are tools in Boros to really deal with that. You can't play stuff that effectively hates on these decks. You can't play Grafdigger's Cage. You can't play Containment Priest.
Right.
Conceivably, you can play Rest in Peace, which I guess deals with some of the stuff. But you can't access it consistently. Then you're looking at going real deep, maybe Sanctifier and Vec, but I'm not even sure that Minsk Hulk just ignores it because you're not playing. You can pile through it pretty easily. Maybe some of those other decks struggle a little bit more, though Pod Lines I think work through Sanctifier and Vec because your Kiki never hits the bin. It's only white cards that go to the bin and blue cards.
Right.
So what are your tools to stop that? They've played, is it Bygone Bishop or no, not Bygone Bishop. It's a flyer, you can sack it to exile Graveyard. Forget what it's called, but that's one shot Grave Hate. I think that the tools, Winota is not in a position to be teched against the decks that beat Winota. The way that decks in higher colors can be teched to deal with a different meta. And I think that
right.
will become increasingly clear over the next few months, particularly if 10% of all of these tournaments are going to be Winota players.
I think that's well said.
It's interesting because I know Ian kind of says that Winota does best against other stacks.
So I think that Winota does best against other, it's Remorseful Cleric was the card I was thinking of. Winota does well against other quote-unquote win-con-less or non-win-con-focused stacks decks.
Mm-hmm.
In a stacked-out game, Winota does well, including against other decks that are ostensibly trying to play a stacked out game, but I don't think it does well against decks that are trying to win a stacked out game with, Birthing Pod combos or Hulk combos or things
right.
like that. You can certainly beat down, I don't know, the Timna Kamal deck. You can put so much hurt on them before they can stick the Kamal that then they can't really attack because you'll just kill them on the crackback or whatever. You can try and find Drenith or things like that. But I think it also does decently well against decks that try and draw their way out of stacks locks, like Thrasios Seedborn Muse type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It'll just keep trying to kill you. And it'll probably succeed eventually. But I think against decks that present consistently accessible stacks resilient win cons, not only does Winota, as it's sort of currently being built, not have the tools, I just don't think the tools exist in Boros without sort of hating your own deck out too much.
Right.
Maybe if there was a human version of Angel of Jubilation.
Yeah.
That would be interesting.
That would, or if Yasharn was in colors, that might sort of do it. But yeah, these effects are not really there. And the ones that do, and
they're difficult to access.
The ones that Boros do actually stop a lot of the combos that Winota is weak to also stop Winota, things like Grafdigger's Cage and Containment Priest.
Right.
So we've talked about all these color pairings. We've kind of gone through all 10 of them here. And I think it goes without saying that Dimir, we all kind of agree is like the best 2-color combo that's out there. But if we were to take Dimir out of it, Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation, those cards, we're not talking about those here. Blue, black, notwithstanding. Which ones, Cobble, and I'll ask this to both of you, and the reasoning behind it, which 2-color combo pairing do you like the most right now?
Right now, I think I'd have to say Rakdos, because I think right now, if you're going, basically, I think that very proactive decks suffer less from having a limited tool set, which is not shocking, right? Like,
right.
A deck like a Thrasios, Tymna, I don't know, Razakats, for example, like every card in that deck, there's a situation where like you want to find it. And when you play these like 5 or 6 turn games, you often have the option of like, I'm going to tutor for something that isn't a win con. So I want to have a wide array of powerful tools available to me. Whereas if you're just tutoring ad nauseum every time, it like kind of doesn't matter that the rest of the things that your demonic tutor can find suck. Because you're just tutoring ad nauseum every time. And so I think that you can get rewarded for that play pattern. I think that Simic should be, in terms of the tools available and the depth, I think that Simic should probably be the best sort of holistically. I think it suffers a bit in the commander department. Also just because people don't want to play Thrasios in Simic because just play more colors. Like, why wouldn't you?
Right.
So yeah, those are sort of that's my holistic and empirical picks.
What do you think, Cobble?
I mean, for me, it does come down to either Simic or Rakdos, and it's close. Rakdos is the fastest of the 2-color combinations, so it's going to have the most instances of those spikes where it just gets under everybody and is able to win before anybody else has cocked their guns.
Right.
And Simic has the most deterministic game plans as long as they aren't forced to use Drift of Phantasms to find a win con. And the ability to interact with the table. So I think Rakdos, if it doesn't hit one of those spikes, it has no hope of, if it doesn't outrace the table, it has kind of like no hope of out interacting the table.
Right.
And it has no ability to generally come back if it misses that window of opportunity. Whereas Simic can interact early and has a much better long game. Now, which one of those translates to a better combination? Something that's going to have more chances of winning early versus something that has more chances of not losing early. It's close for me. So I'm going to say Simic just to say something different from Spleen.
It's Azorius. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Ojutai is actually not just the best Azorius commander, it's actually the best 2-color commander.
Just
right?
the best 2-color commander.
Actually, it's
yeah,
it's just well, I mean, think about it. If it's the best 2-color commanders, and typically the best commanders in the format are 2-color, right? Like Thrasios and Tymna, that just means it's the best commander.
I mean,
you can't, not me.
Can't push back on that logic.
By the transitive property, right? That's how that works.
Yeah.
Yes. Ergo, QED.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you guys for your thoughts and all that stuff. My good friend Spleenface, what are you guys doing over there to the north?
We're
Backstabber.
We're just churning out episodes quasi-regularly. Yeah, we're still, I guess, getting back into the groove of things after Tier 1 Con. I think we're starting to work on lining up some guests for special episodes where we do deep dives on decks. The episode that's currently in the pipeline features special guest Nathan Jones, aka the Hermit Druid, who is always a fun one. So make sure to check that out. It'll probably be released around the same time as this episode. Yeah, so just make sure to check that out.
Yeah, well, we always love what you guys are doing over there. You guys do make great content. So, and Cobble, what's going on over with the Lab Maniacs? Are you anything new coming on over there?
There is new stuff, and it's just kind of a little bit slow moving, and that's okay. So we did some Conquest gameplay recording, so that'll be coming out in not too long. And
you've been enjoying playing Conquest recently, haven't you?
Yes, it is a fun respite from cEDH. I still enjoy cEDH more probably, but it is definitely worth checking out, especially if somebody is feeling burned out from Consult Oracle.
Getting comboed on turn 2 over and over again. It's definitely, my experience has been that it supports a lot more strategy diversity.
Yes.
Than cEDH does, which is definitely nice to get a little bit of fresh air.
Right.
Yeah.
It
also has much less turbulence and variance as far as starts are concerned, based on seating position and based on mulligans. So there's a lot more balance in the early game, and there's a lot less, this person got first seat and mulliganed well, so they win.
Right.
That sort of thing is mitigated to great extent.
Yeah, it's an interesting format.
Yeah, it doesn't scratch all the same itches of like the crazy, super powerful, like wild plays that you get in cEDH, right. But it's like
Hull Breacher's legal.
You can't do a turn 1 peer into the abyss as easily like Pongo did.
Yeah. Oh boy, that was a game. It's kind of like, if cEDH is like vintage, it's kind of like modern, I would say, where like it's just a little bit more level, or like maybe it's more like the modern of like 2015 and before. I know modern's gotten a little...
Modern's wild right now.
Modern's been a little wild for the last couple of years, but like, the modern where like...
we grew up on.
Yeah, where Jund and like Jeskai Control and, like even the decks that got banned like Pod and Twin weren't like kill you on turn 2 decks. They were just
I've said this before. You could unban Twin and Pod in Modern right now, and it would be perfectly fine.
Possibly.
The stuff that's going on in Modern right now, we're not a Modern podcast, but the stuff that's going on in Modern right now, you could unban those 2 cards safely. I guarantee you, of all the things that we've said in this entire podcast, that little thing there for me is probably at the very end will probably get the most hate. Just me saying, no, you could unban Pod and Twin, it'd be fine.
No. I'm fully expecting to get swarmed by all the Winota fans. And the worst part is they all get a free reinforcement from the top 6 cards of their deck when they come in and mess up the comment section. So
unless there's a Grafdigger's Cage.
Exactly.
So the lesson here is play Grafdigger's Cage, play Weathered Runestone, get some hate for the Winota decks out there. Well, thank you all for joining us. That about wraps things up for today. Just a quick reminder that you can follow us on Twitter at SculptyBoys, BOIS, or you can find a direct link in our link tree in the description below as well. Want to also give an extra shout out to all of our patrons who help keep the lights on. If you too would like to become a patron, you can head on over to patreon.com/The Mind Sculptors or check out the link in the description. Thank you again for joining us, and from all of us here at The Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.
I'm in line with the stars, I'm in sync with the earth. 10 toes deep, flower child from the turf. I never switch sides, like even when I die, I'ma ride for the squad, let our ties in the hearse. I've been on a vibe, kinda hard to describe. I'm in between, I'm good and it's fine, but I'm tired of the grind. Then I come alive in the night to realize I'm in the middle of the time of my life. I never sold pack for the stack, never lied on the rap. Got a bag from the way that I write it. Queen looking Tyson, through that I survived, doing 80 to the house. Then I hit it to the sky, changed haters on a tirade. Talking to their crib in the face, be still, let that hate stuff fade. We all want the same, we all want a meal in the safe. I wanna live like I'm trying to reach enlightenment. Trail spill from my lips, feel big from the bib. Take a sip till I pass out. Try and get grit, but it don't make sense, cause you can lose life on this fast route. Yeah, turn thoughts to a cash cow. I might flip that to the glass house. I don't need the accolades, I'm in love with the chase. I just wanna eat, save a spot at the table. Beast with the slap, hit myself on the map. You long with the wind, but we knowing that it's cap. 5-hour flights, couple nights at the flat. To be real, couldn't see me making moves while I'm at. I'm still on the grind, limit time when I chat. I'm burning down sage, keep the demons away. When I write it, give a piece of myself to the page. I don't do it for the praise, love, that's just how I'm made.
From the glass in the mirror,
Yeah.
do it at me, old man, tryna pass in the fear. You're the first one to talk, but the last one to hear. Eyes blurry, but I couldn't see the ass any clear.